The Deir Yassin massacre took place on April 9, 1948, when around 120 fighters from the Zionist paramilitary groups Irgun and Lehi attacked Deir Yassin near Jerusalem, a Palestinian Arab village of roughly 600 people. The assault occurred as Jewish militia sought to relieve the blockade of Jerusalem by Palestinian Arab forces during the civil war that preceded the end of British rule in Palestine. The residents resisted the attack, and the village fell only after fierce house-to-house fighting. 107 villagers were killed during and after the battle for the village, including women and children. Some were shot, while others died when hand grenades were thrown into their homes. Several villagers were taken prisoner and may have been killed after being paraded through the streets of West Jerusalem, though accounts vary. 4 of the attackers were killed, with around 35 injured. The killings were condemned by the leadership of the Haganah, the Jewish community's main paramilitary force, and by the area's 2 chief rabbis. The Jewish Agency for Israel sent Jordan's King Abdullah a letter of apology, which he rebuffed. Abdullah saw the Jewish Agency as responsible for the massacre, because he saw them as the head of the Jewish affairs in Palestine and thought they caused such incidents, and warned about terrible consequences if more incidents like that occurred. The deaths became a pivotal event in the Arab-Israeli conflict for their demographic and military consequences. The narrative was embellished and used by various parties to attack each other, by the Palestinians against Israel, by the Haganah to play down their own role in the affair, and by the Israeli left to accuse the Irgun and Lehi of violating the Jewish principle of purity of arms, thus blackening Israel's name around the world. News of the killings sparked terror among Palestinians, encouraging them to flee from their towns and villages in the face of Jewish troop advances, and it strengthened the resolve of Arab governments to intervene, which they did 5 weeks later. Background: political and military situation. The attack on Deir Yassin took place after the United Nations proposed on November 29, 1947 that Palestine be divided into an Arab state and a Jewish one. Jerusalem was to belong to neither state, but was to be administered separately. Deir Yassin lay within the boundaries of the proposed plan for Jerusalem. The Arabs rejected the proposal, and civil war broke out. British rule in Palestine ended on May 14, 1948. Israel declared its independence that day, and several Arab armies invaded at midnight on May 15, triggering the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. In the months leading up to the end of British rule, in a phase of the civil war known as the Battle of the Rhodes, the Arab League-sponsored Arab Liberation Army, composed of Palestinians and other Arabs, attacked Jewish traffic on major roads in an effort to isolate the Jewish communities from each other. The ALA managed to seize several strategic vantage points along the highway between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, Jerusalem's sole supply route and link to the western side of the city, and began firing on convoys traveling to the city. By March 1948, the road was cut off and Jerusalem was under siege. In response, the Haganah launched Operation Naxon to break the siege. On April 6, in an effort to secure strategic positions, the Haganah and its strike force, the Palmish, attacked Al-Kastel, a village 2 kilometers north of Deir Yassin overlooking the Jerusalem-Tel Aviv highway. On April 9, Irgun and Lehi forces attacked nearby Deir Yassin. Deir Yassin was a Palestinian Arab village of several hundred residents, all Muslim, living in 144 houses. The International Committee of the Red Cross reported that there were 400 residents. Joab Gelba writes that there were 610, citing the British Mandatory Authority figures, and Menahem Begin's biographer, Eric Silver, 800 to 1,000. It was situated on a hill west of Jerusalem, 800 meters above sea level, overlooking the main highway entering Jerusalem. The village was relatively prosperous, thanks to the excavation of limestone from its quarries, which allowed the residents to make a good living from stone cutting. By most accounts, they lived in peace with their Jewish neighbors in nearby villages, particularly those in Givat Shaul, an Orthodox community just across the valley, some of whom reportedly tried to help the Deir Yassin villagers during the Irgun and Lehi invasion. On January 20, 1948, the villagers met leaders of the Givat Shaul community to form a peace pact. The Deir Yassin villagers agreed to inform Givat Shaul should Palestinian militiamen appear in the village, by hanging out certain types of laundry during the day, 2 white pieces with a black piece in the middle, and at night signaling 3 dots with a flashlight and placing 3 lanterns in a certain place. In return, patrols from Givat Shaul guaranteed safe passage to Deir Yassin residents, in vehicles or on foot, passing through their neighborhood on the way to Jerusalem. Yomer ben Sasson, Haganah commander in Givat Shaul, said after the village had been captured that there was not even one incident between Deir Yassin and the Jews. Arab militiamen had tried to set up camp in the village, leading to a firefight that saw 1 villager killed. Just before January 28, Abd al-Qadir had arrived with 400 men and tried to recruit some villagers. But the elders voiced their opposition, and the men moved on. The leader of the village, the Muqtad, was summoned to Jerusalem to explain to the Arab Higher Committee, the Palestinian Arab leadership, what the village's relationship was with the Jews. He told him the villagers and the Jews lived in peace. No steps were taken against him, and he was not asked to cancel the peace pact. On February 13, an armed gang of Arabs arrived to attack Givat Shaul, but the Deir Yassin villagers saw them off, the result of which was that the gang killed all the villagers' sheep. On March 16, the AHC sent a delegation to the village to request that it host a group of Iraqi and Syrian irregulars to guard it. The villagers said no then, and again on April 4. Though Irgun fighters said they did encounter at least 2 foreign militiamen during the April 9 invasion, the view that the relationship between Deir Yassin and its neighbors was invariably peaceful is disputed by Yehuda Lapidot, the Irgun's second-in-command of the operation to take the village. He writes that there had been occasional skirmishes between Deir Yassin and Givat Shaul residents, and that on April 3, shots had been fired from Deir Yassin toward the Jewish villages of Bet HaKarim and Yefer and Of. He writes that the village was defended by 100 armed men, that ditches had been dug around it, that Iraqi and Palestinian guerrillas were stationed there, and that there was a guard force stationed by the village entrance. Benny Morris writes that it is possible some militiamen were stationed in the village, but the evidence is far from definitive, in his view. In Gelber's view, it is unlikely that the peace pact between Deir Yassin and Givat Shaul continued to hold in April, given the intensity of hostilities between the Arab and Jewish communities elsewhere. He writes that shots had been exchanged on April 2 between Deir Yassin and several Jewish communities. Over the next few days, the Jewish community at Motza and Jewish traffic on the road to Tel Aviv came under fire from the village. On April 8, Deir Yassin youth took part in the defense of the Arab village of Al-Kastel, which the Jews had invaded days earlier. The names of several Deir Yassin residents appeared on a list of wounded compiled by the British Palestine Police. Irgun and Lehi militia, the Jewish forces that entered Deir Yassin, belonged in the main to 2 extremist, underground, paramilitary groups. The Irgun and the Lehi, also known as the Stern Gang, both aligned with the right-wing revisionist Zionist movement. Formed in 1931, Irgun was a militant group that broke away from the mainstream Jewish militia, the Haganah, during the 1936–39 Arab revolt in Palestine, in which Palestinian Arabs rose up against the British Mandate authorities in protest at mass Jewish immigration into the country. Irgun's tactics had included bus and marketplace bombings, condemned by both the British and the Jewish Agency. Lehi, an Irgun splinter group, was formed in 1940 following Irgun's decision to declare a truce with the British during World War II. Lehi subsequently carried out a series of assassinations designed to force the British out of Palestine. In April 1948, it was estimated that the Irgun had 300 fighters in Jerusalem, and Lehi around 100. The Palmish, the strike force of the Haganah, whose leadership was aligned with the political left, also took part, though to a lesser extent. Morris writes that 2 Palmish squads evacuated the wounded, and helped invade and secure some of the village's houses. When the Irgun and Lehi fighters ran low on ammunition, they obtained thousands of rounds from the Haganah. Haganah squads also provided covering fire, and fired on villages fleeing south towards Ein Karim. Battle plans. Decision to attack. The attack on the village was important for 2 reasons, according to Yehuda Lapidot of the Irgun. In the view of Irgun and Lehi, it posed a threat to Jewish neighborhoods and the main road to the coastal plain, and it was the first time Jewish forces had gone on the offensive, as opposed to responding to attacks. An assault on the village would show the Arabs that the Jews intended to fight for Jerusalem. Eric Silver writes that Irgun and Lehi commanders approached David Shaltiel, the Haganah commander in Jerusalem, for approval. He was initially reluctant, because the villages had signed a non-aggression pact, and suggested attacking Ein Karim instead. The Lehi and Irgun commanders complained that this would be too hard for them. Shaltiel ultimately yielded, on condition that the attackers remain in the village rather than leaving it empty, to prevent it becoming an Arab military base. His approval met with resistance. Mir Pari, an intelligence officer with the Palmish, the Haganah's strike force, objected to violating the peace pact with the village, but Shaltiel maintained that he had no power to stop them. Pari said in 1998 that Yitzchak Levi, head of Haganah intelligence in Jerusalem, had proposed the inhabitants be notified, but Shaltiel had refused to endanger the operation by warning them. According to Morris, it was agreed during planning meetings that the residents would be expelled. Lehi further proposed that any villagers who failed to flee should be killed to terrify the rest of the country's Arabs. Most of the fighters at the meetings, from both the Irgun and Lehi, favored killing the male villagers, but the Irgun High Command, including Menahem Begin, objected. According to Lapidot, the troops were specifically ordered not to kill women, children, or prisoners. Pre-attack briefing. According to the Haganah, the attack force consisted of about 120 men, 80 from the Irgun and 40 from Lehi. They met for briefings on April 8, a few hours before the attack began. Lehi would stage its attack from Givat Shaul, and the Irgun from Beit HaKarim. Lapidot writes that the mood at the Irgun meeting was festive. It was the first time a large number of underground fighters had met openly, and the collaboration between the groups increased their sense of solidarity. They chose a password to reflect the mood, AHDUT low-end. This was the phrase that would signal the start of the attack. According to Lapidot, Mordecai Ranan, the Irgun district commander in Jerusalem, stressed that women, children, and the elderly must not be harmed, and that the villagers were to be warned by loudspeaker to give them a chance to escape. The road to Ein Karim would be left open so they could head there.